In the small coastal town of Willow Bay, where the scent of salt and seaweed clung to the evening breeze, Page's Haven bookstore stood as a quiet beacon between a bustling bakery and a weathered pier, its windows glowing with the promise of stories yet untold. On this Saturday night, the bookstore transformed into a sanctuary for the town's weekly poetry night, where fairy lights woven through exposed brick walls cast a warm golden haze over rows of mismatched chairs filled with locals cradling teacups and worn paperbacks. Elias Grant, an 8-year-old boy with cerebral palsy, sat in the back row, his thin fingers tracing the edges of a crumpled notebook page where his poem about the ocean's whispers lay hidden like a secret he wasn't sure he could share. His condition made every movement a battle, his arms jerking unpredictably, his speech a careful string of slurred syllables, each word a hard-won treasure that often stayed locked inside him. Poetry was his refuge, a way to capture the waves. He watched from his bedroom window, their rhythm steady even when his body wasn't, but the thought of standing before a crowd made his chest tighten with fear. Beside him sat his father, Thomas Grant, a 40-year-old accountant whose life was measured in spreadsheets and schedules, his face etched with lines of worry that deepened whenever Elias ventured beyond the safety of routine. Thomas had spent years building a fortress of caution around his son, choosing quiet corners and controlled environments to shield him from the world's sharp edges, especially after a school event where Elias's stumble had drawn stifled laughs from other children. The bookstore's small wooden platform, scuffed from years of hesitant footsteps, wasn't a stage but a space where locals shared verses, their voices weaving through the clink of porcelain and the rustle of turning pages, creating a fragile intimacy that felt both inviting and daunting. Margaret Lane, a 32-year-old bookstore employee, moved through the crowd with a dancer's grace, her dark hair pulled into a loose braid, her hands steady as she poured chamomile tea from a chipped pot. Once a spoken-word poet who commanded city stages, Margaret had retreated to Willow Bay after a public performance, where her voice cracked and the audience's laughter burned away her confidence, leaving her to stack books and serve tea in silence. Elias's eyes followed her, not the young man reciting a poem about forgotten summers at the front, but Margaret's quiet movements, the way she navigated tables with a rhythm that seemed to hum beneath her stillness. As she paused to refill Elias's cup, their gazes locked, his wide with a longing he couldn't name, hers softened by a flicker of recognition, as if she saw the weight of unspoken words in his stare. He whispered, his voice barely breaking the air, asking if she ever wrote poems like the ones echoing through the room, his words slurring but deliberate, each one a small act of courage. Margaret knelt beside him, her apron brushing the floor, and admitted she used to write when someone gave her a reason to believe words could still carry light. Elias's fingers trembled as he opened his notebook, revealing lines about waves crashing and stars blinking, his handwriting shaky but alive with feeling, a map of thoughts he'd never shared aloud. He confessed his fear, his voice catching, saying he was scared the crowd would laugh or turn away, that his words wouldn't come out right. Margaret didn't push or promise it would be easy, but her eyes held his, steady and warm, and she said if he stood, she'd listen, her voice, a quiet anchor in the room's soft chaos. Elias's heart thudded, his legs twitching beneath the table, unsure if they could carry him, but her words were a spark, kindling a courage he hadn't known he possessed. He glanced at Thomas, whose hand hovered as if to stop him, his jaw tight with the instinct to protect, to pull Elias back into the safety of silence. But Elias's gaze returned to Margaret, her presence a promise that someone would hear him, not for his flaws, but for his truth. The room seemed to expand, the air growing heavy with anticipation. As Elias pushed his chair back, the scrape of wood against floor louder than the poet's closing lines, his heart a drumbeat against the murmurs of the crowd. Elias Grant's small frame trembled as he rose from his chair, the Page's Haven poetry night holding its breath, the faint clatter of teacups fading into a hush that felt like the world pausing to watch a boy dare to be seen. His legs, unsteady from cerebral palsy, wobbled with each step toward the wooden platform, his right hand clutching the crumpled notebook page, its edges worn from anxious fingers, while his left arm swung awkwardly to balance a body that often betrayed him. The crowd's eyes followed, not with pity but with a quiet curiosity, as if sensing something fragile yet fierce unfolding before them. Elias's heart pounded louder than the waves he wrote about, each beat a reminder of the laughter he'd once heard at a school event, sharp and unthinking, that had locked his voice inside him ever since. Yet Margaret Lane's words, if he stood, she'd listen, burned brighter than fear, a beacon pulling him forward, her steady gaze from the side of the room a lifeline he clung to without touching. He reached the platform, the wood creaking under his sneakers, and stood alone, his breath hitching as he faced the sea of faces, their expressions unreadable in the dim glow of fairy lights. Thomas Grant, his father, sat rigid in the back, his accountant's hands clenched, fighting the urge to rush forward, to shield Elias from the risk of stumbling over words or worse, silence. Elias opened his notebook, the page shaking in his grip, and began to speak, his voice a soft, slurred melody, each syllable a labor of love, piecing together a poem about the ocean's secrets, how it whispered hope to those who listened closely. The words came unevenly, some tripping over his tongue, others clear and piercing, painting images of waves that didn't need to be perfect to be beautiful. Margaret stepped closer, not onto the platform but near its edge, her presence as silent. Vow to hear him, her eyes never wavering, as if she could see the boy's soul in every faltered syllable. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not laughter but a soft intake of breath, as a teenage girl with braided hair stood from her seat, her own notebook clutched tight, and took a step toward the platform, not to speak but to stand in solidarity, her quiet nod a signal she saw Elias's courage. An older man, his cane tapping softly, joined her, his weathered face softening as he mirrored her gesture, standing not for applause but to share the weight of the moment. Elias's voice grew steadier, not louder, but surer, as if the room's rising presence fueled him, his poem weaving through the air, simple yet raw, about stars that flickered, even when clouds hid them. Thomas's throat tightened, his instinct to protect warring with a swell of pride he hadn't expected, his son's voice, a sound he'd rarely heard so unguarded, cutting through his carefully built walls. Margaret's own heart stirred, memories of her own stage days flashing briefly, not the failure that silenced her, but the thrill of words that once moved strangers, now rekindled by a boy who spoke, despite fear. The crowd didn't clap, not yet, but their stillness was reverence, not judgment, as Elias reached the final line, his voice cracking on "Hope rides the tide," and he lowered the notebook, his chest heaving, eyes searching for Margaret. She nodded, a small smile breaking through, not pitying but proud, as if she'd heard not just his poem but the heartbeat behind it. The teenage girl stepped onto the platform, not speaking, just standing beside Elias, her presence a quiet echo of his bravery, followed by a young father who left his toddler with his wife to join them, his own hesitant steps a mirror to Elias's. The room felt alive, not with sound but with connection, as if Elias's trembling voice had woven a thread that pulled strangers together, not to perform, but to witness, to share in a moment that didn't need perfection to be profound. Thomas's hands unclenched, his eyes locked on his son, who stood taller now, not physically but in spirit, leading a room without knowing it, his poem a small revolution that shifted something unspoken in everyone watching. Margaret felt a pang not of sadness, but of recognition, seeing in Elias the courage she'd lost, her own pen itching to write again, stirred by a boy who dared to speak when the world expected silence. Elias looked out, his breath steadying, and for the first time he didn't search for laughter or judgment, only the faces now standing with him, their quiet steps a chorus of trust he hadn't known he could inspire. The poem ended, but the moment didn't, lingering like the last note of a song too soft to fade, and Elias stood not alone but held by a community that chose to rise with him. The air in Page's Haven bookstore hung thick with a quiet that wasn't silence but reverence, as Elias Grant stepped off the wooden platform, his sneakers scuffing softly, his chest still rising from the effort of sharing his poem, a fragile triumph that left the crowd standing in scattered, unspoken solidarity. The teenage girl with braided hair lingered near him, her eyes bright with admiration, whispering that she'd never dared read her own words aloud until tonight. Her voice, a shy confession that made Elias's lips curve into a hesitant smile. The older man with the cane, now back in his seat, tapped his fingers on its handle, his gaze fixed on Elias as if seeing a younger self who once stood against doubt, while the young father who joined them on the platform knelt to hug his toddler, who giggled and pointed at Elias, calling him the poem boy. The room pulsed with a new energy, not of applause but of connection. As strangers exchanged glances, their faces softening with the realization that a boy's unsteady voice had stirred something they hadn't expected to feel. Thomas Grant sat frozen in the back, his accountant's hands gripping the edge of his chair, his heart a tangle of pride and fear, the image of Elias standing alone, yet not alone, burning into him like sunlight through a cracked window. He'd spent years scripting Elias's life, mapping every outing to avoid the sting of failure. The memory of a schoolyard laugh still raw, but now his son had stepped beyond that script, and Thomas felt unmoored, as if the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. Margaret Lane, standing near the platform's edge, watched Elias return to his seat, her hands clasped to keep them steady, her own past as a poet flickering like a candle she thought had long gone out, stirred by the boy's courage to speak, where she'd chosen silence. A woman in her 40s with grey streaks in her hair approached Elias, her voice gentle as she asked if he'd written other poems, her question not patronizing but genuine, as if his words had unlocked a memory of her own forgotten dreams. Elias nodded shyly, his fingers brushing the notebook, and said he wrote about the stars sometimes, his slurred words carrying a quiet pride that made the woman's eyes shimmer. Another patron, a retired teacher with a worn scarf, joined the conversation, sharing how her students used to write poems but never shared them, and now she wished she'd encouraged them more, her voice thick with regret and resolve. The crowd's murmur grew, not loud but alive as people began to talk, not about Elias's condition but about his presence, their stories weaving a tapestry of small confessions, each one a thread pulled loose by a boy's bravery. Thomas watched, his throat tight, his instinct to pull Elias back to safety warring with the sight of strangers drawn to his son, not to fix him but to meet him where he stood. A young couple near the front shared a poem they'd written together, inspired by Elias's act, their voices shaky but bold, and the room listened, not judging but celebrating, as if Elias had opened a door they'd all been too afraid to touch. Margaret caught Thomas's eye, her expression not triumphant but knowing, as if she understood the storm inside him, the fear of letting go clashing with the awe of seeing Elias lead. A child from another table, no older than 6, tugged at her mother's sleeve, asking if she could write a poem too, her small voice carrying a spark that made Margaret smile, a smile that hid her own ache to reclaim the stage she'd abandoned. Thomas's mind raced, replaying every moment he'd held Elias back, every time he'd answered for him, walked for him, decided for him, believing it was love. But now he saw the cost, the way his protection had dimmed the light in his son's eyes. A man in a flannel shirt, who'd been silent all night, stood and shared a story about his brother, who'd never spoken clearly but loved to sing, and how he wished he'd listened more, his voice breaking as he thanked Elias for reminding him. The room wasn't a performance anymore but a shared heartbeat, each person touched by a boy who didn't need to be perfect to be powerful. Thomas's hands loosened, his shoulders slumping, not in defeat, but in surrender, as he realized. Elias wasn't just his to protect, but a person who could move others, who could move him. Margaret stepped closer to Elias, offering a glass of water, her voice soft as she said his poem made her want to write again, her words a quiet confession that felt like a vow. Elias looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and said he'd like to hear her poem someday. His voice steady despite its slur, a spark of leadership in his gaze that made Margaret's heart catch. The night wound down, but the energy lingered, people lingering to talk, to share, to carry Elias's courage home with them, while Thomas sat still and quiet, grappling with a truth he couldn't yet name, that his son didn't need his shield as much as his trust. The old sedan hummed along Willow Bay's coastal road, its headlights cutting through the soft darkness, the ocean's distant roar a faint pulse beneath the quiet that settled between Elias Grant and his father, Thomas, as they drove home from the bookstore, the weight of the night still unfolding like a tide pulling back to reveal hidden shells. Elias sat in the passenger seat, his small hands resting on his lap, his fingers no longer clutching his notebook but tracing the seam of his jeans, his eyes fixed on the blurred glow of streetlights streaking past, each one a fleeting star in the night's vast canvas. Thomas gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale, his accountant's mind struggling to process the image of his son standing tall, not just in body, but in spirit, a vision that challenged every instinct he'd honed to keep Elias safe from a world that could be unkind. The silence wasn't heavy but alive, humming with unspoken thoughts, as if the car itself held its breath waiting for one of them to speak. Elias's legs swung slightly, not quite reaching the floor, a reminder of his youth, yet his face carried a stillness that felt older, as if the act of sharing his voice had carved a new edge to his being. Thomas stole a glance at his son, expecting to see the familiar flicker of uncertainty, but instead found Elias's gaze steady, almost serene, as if the boy had found a piece of himself on that platform and brought it home. The dashboard clock glowed 9:17, late for a school night, but time felt irrelevant, the usual rules of bedtime and routine suspended in the wake of something larger. Elias broke the silence, his voice soft but clear, slurring only slightly, saying he didn't need Thomas to always speak for him anymore, the words landing like a pebble in still water, rippling through the car's quiet. Thomas's breath caught, his hands tightening briefly, the urge to respond with logic, to explain his protective habits clashing with the raw honesty in his son's voice. Elias continued, his fingers pausing on the seam, saying he knew he might stumble, that his words might tangle, but he wanted to try to let his own voice fall and rise even if it wasn't perfect. The road curved past a row of weathered beach houses, their porch lights casting long shadows, and Thomas felt the weight of every moment he'd stepped in, answered for Elias, chosen the safer path, believing it was love, not control. His mind flashed to a memory of Elias at 5, struggling to tie his shoes, Thomas taking over when the task took too long, not seeing the frustration in his son's eyes until now. Elias's voice grew quieter, saying he felt strong tonight. Not because he didn't falter, but because someone listened, really listened, and it made him want to keep trying. Thomas swallowed, his throat tight, the familiar need to protect warring with a new ache, a realization that his shielding might have dimmed the light Elias was now claiming. The boy turned to face his father, his eyes catching the faint glow of a passing street lamp, and said he wasn't asking to be alone just to be the one to choose his steps sometimes. His words not defiant but earnest, a plea wrapped in courage. Thomas's heart thudded, his usual answers about safety, about the world's harshness, feeling thin against the truth of his son's voice, a voice that didn't ask for permission but simply existed, claiming space. He pulled into their driveway, the engine's hum fading but neither moved to unbuckle, the car a cocoon holding their words. Thomas finally spoke, his voice low, admitting he'd always thought love meant keeping Elias from falling, from hurting, but now he wasn't sure what love should look like. Elias nodded, his small hand reaching for the door handle, but he paused, saying he still needed his dad, just not always in front, leading the way. The words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that shifted something deep in Thomas, like a lock turning in a door he hadn't known was there. He remembered every time he'd carried Elias through crowds, spoken for him at doctor's visits, chosen his activities to avoid risk, each choice a brick in a wall he thought was protection, but now saw as a barrier. Elias unbuckled his seatbelt, the click sharp in the quiet, and looked at Thomas, his eyes not pleading but steady, saying he wanted to be the one to try, even if it meant falling sometimes. Thomas's chest ached, not with guilt but with awe, seeing his son not as fragile but as fierce, a boy who could lead in ways he hadn't imagined. The porch light spilled across the lawn, soft and welcoming, but Thomas stayed still, his hands resting on the wheel, as if letting go of it meant letting go of something larger. Elias opened the car door, his movements slow but deliberate, and stepped out, his silhouette small but unyielding against the night. Thomas watched, his breath shallow, realizing that love might mean standing behind, not in front, ready to catch but not to carry. The night air seeped into the car, cool and sharp, as Elias walked toward the house, his steps uneven but his own, leaving Thomas to sit in the quiet, grappling with a truth he was only beginning to understand. His son was leading, and he needed to learn how to follow. In the weeks following the poetry night, Page's Haven bookstore opened its doors to a new community writing workshop, a sunlit room at the back where mismatched tables were strewn with notebooks and pencils, and Elias Grant, now a regular, sat, with a small group of children and adults, his notebook open to a fresh page, his eyes alight with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. The workshop, led by Margaret Lane, was a haven for voices often unheard, kids with stutters, adults with trembling hands, each drawn by the bookstore's promise of a space where words didn't need to be perfect to matter. Elias, his movements, still marked by the unpredictable jerks of cerebral palsy, scribbled lines about the wind's secrets, his pencil wobbling, but his focus steady. Each word a step in a dance he was learning to lead. Margaret moved among the tables, her voice gentle but firm, offering prompts not as instructions but as invitations, her own notebook tucked under her arm, filled with poems she'd begun writing again, stirred by Elias's courage but not yet, ready to share. Thomas Grant sat in a corner, not guiding Elias but observing, his accountant's precision replaced by a quiet unease as he tried to unlearn the habit of controlling his son's world. His pen hovering over a blank page, Margaret had insisted he try. The room buzzed with soft voices, a young girl with a lisp reading about her dog's muddy paws, an older woman sharing a memory of her mother's garden, each story a thread weaving a tapestry of trust. And Elias listened, his smile widening, his own voice growing bolder with each session. Margaret challenged the group to write about something they'd lost, and Elias, after a long pause, read a poem about the shadow of fear he'd carried, his slurred words painting a picture of a boy who once hid but now reached for the light, his voice trembling but unbroken. Thomas's heart clenched, not with the urge to intervene but with a pang of recognition, seeing Elias claim a space he'd never dared imagine, his son's courage a mirror to his own tightly held fears. A boy with a walker, inspired by Elias, shared a halting story about climbing a hill, and the group nodded, not correcting his stumbles but celebrating his climb, their silence a chorus of encouragement. Margaret watched Elias, her own pen moving faster now, her poems spilling onto the page like a river unblocked, each line a step toward reclaiming the voice she'd buried after her stage failure. Thomas, prompted by Margaret to write, scratched out a single line about letting go of a ledger he'd never balanced, his words clumsy but raw, a confession of his struggle to trust Elias's path. A teenage participant, her voice sharp with defiance, read about breaking free from her parents' expectations, and Elias clapped, his hands unsteady but earnest, sparking a ripple of laughter that warmed the room. Thomas felt the weight of his own pen, each word he wrote a crack in the armor he'd worn as protector, his mind flashing to moments he'd dismissed Elias's small victories, assuming they weren't enough. Margaret knelt beside a shy adult who'd never written before, guiding without leading, her presence a quiet echo of the support she'd given Elias, and she caught Thomas's eye, nodding as if to say he was learning too, his silence not absence, but growth. Elias, now reading almost every session, shared a new poem about a kite that flew despite tangled strings, his voice steadier, his eyes meeting those of his listeners, no longer searching for judgment, but connection. The workshop became a ritual, each week peeling back layers of doubt, not just for Elias but for Thomas, who began to see his son not as a boy to shield, but as a leader who could inspire. A woman in her 60s, her hands gnarled from arthritis, thanked Elias for her own courage to write, her voice thick with gratitude, and Elias blushed, his small frame seeming to grow in the glow of her words. Thomas wrote another line, about a father who followed instead of led, his hand shaking, not from fear but from the weight of unlearning years of control. Margaret, watching the group, felt her own heart shift, her poems now carrying the spark of Elias's defiance, her fear of the stage loosening like a knot slowly untied. The room's windows caught the afternoon sun, casting golden patches on the floor, and Elias, finishing a poem, looked at Thomas, not for approval, but to share a moment, his smile a bridge between them. Thomas nodded back, his own page now half filled, each word a step toward trusting Elias's strength, his role as father redefined not by holding up but by standing beside, The workshop ended with the group sharing a quiet moment, their notebooks open, their voices mingling. A community built not on perfection, but on the courage to try, led by a boy whose unsteady steps had become a beacon. The Willow Bay Literary Festival filled a modest auditorium with paper lanterns swaying in the warm May breeze, their soft glow illuminating rows of folding chairs packed with families, teachers, and neighbors, all gathered to celebrate voices that rarely took center stage, the air thick with anticipation, and the faint scent of blooming jasmine from the open windows. Callias Grant stood backstage, his small hands smoothing a simple white shirt, his black pants slightly too long, his hair neatly combed by Thomas an hour earlier, a ritual that felt less like control and more like a quiet gesture of love. The 8-year-old's heart raced, not with the fear that once kept him silent, but with a fire kindled by weeks of sharing his words, his cerebral palsy no longer a cage but a rhythm he'd learned to move within, his new poem about a path he carved, himself tucked in his pocket. Margaret Lane, now a co-organizer, had quietly arranged for Elias to perform last, not as a finale but as an opening to something new, her own notebook heavy with poems she hadn't yet dared to read aloud, her eyes bright with pride as she watched. Elias stand ready. Thomas Grant waited in the wings, his accountant's tie loosened, his hands no longer clenched but open, his presence not to guide but to witness, his heart still adjusting to the shift from protector to follower, a role he was learning step by step. The announcer, a librarian with a warm smile, stepped to the microphone, her voice steady as she introduced Elias, saying he didn't have a song or a script, just a direction that was enough, her words fading as the crowd stilled, their eyes. Turning to the stage, Elias walked out, his steps uneven but deliberate, the auditorium's quiet swallowing the soft creak of his sneakers, his gaze fixed not on the crowd, but on a point in the distance, where the horizon of his own courage lay. He stood center stage, knees slightly bent, arms relaxed, and for a moment he wavered, the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing against him, but he breathed deep, the memory of Margaret's promise to listen anchoring him. He began his poem, his voice slurred but strong, weaving a tale of a boy who built a road from broken stones, each word a testament to choosing his own way, his delivery raw and unpolished, yet piercing in its truth. A woman in the 5th row, her hair streaked with silver, rose quietly, not to speak but to step into the aisle, mirroring Elias's rhythm with a slow nod, her eyes wet with recognition of a courage she'd forgotten in herself. A man in a wheelchair rolled forward, his hands steady on the wheels, turning to face Elias, not out of pity but respect, his movement a silent echo of the boy's resolve. One by one, others stood, parents, teenagers, a baker with flour-dusted hands, each taking a step, not toward the stage but with Elias, their gestures small but profound, a dance of acknowledgement that needed no music. Thomas watched, his breath shallow, his chest swelling with a pride that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds, seeing his son not as fragile but as a force, leading a room without asking permission. Margaret stood backstage, her arms crossed, her throat tight, her own unwritten poems stirring, the boy's voice rekindling a spark she thought lost forever, pushing her closer to the stage she'd sworn never to reclaim. Elias's poem ended, his final line about a road that led to stars ringing clear, his voice steady despite its tremble, and he stood, palms open, not seeking applause but holding space, his small frame a beacon in the soft light. The crowd didn't clap, not yet, but their rising bodies spoke louder, nearly half the auditorium now standing, moving in quiet gestures, nods, steps, raised hands, that said they saw him, not his stumbles, but his strength. Thomas felt his eyes burn, not with fear but with awe, his role as father redefined, not as the one who holds up but as the one who walks behind, trusting Elias's path. Margaret stepped closer, her hand brushing Elias's shoulder as he left the stage, whispering that his words made her want to try again, her voice a vow to herself as much as to him. Elias smiled, his eyes meeting hers, saying he'd be there. When she read, his slurred words carrying a leadership that made her heart catch. Backstage, Thomas approached, his voice low, telling Elias he was proud, not just of the poem but of the boy who chose to stand, his words faltering as he admitted. He was learning to follow. The three stood together, the auditorium's hum fading, and later in the bookstore's quiet back room, they sat, sharing tea and soft laughter, Elias sketching a new poem, Margaret writing her first stage piece in years, and Thomas jotting a note about trust, their paths intertwined by a boy who led not by perfection, but by daring to move. The festival ended, but its echo lingered, a reminder that leadership is not in the loudest voice, but in the one that moves others to rise, a lesson carved in the heart of a community that followed a boy's unsteady steps.